It's been quite a while since I first took a look at Dragon Quest games running on the Steam Deck, about a year and a half ago, well probably over. And since then I've always wanted to go back to this particular topic, as there's some games I missed out on, some requests people made in the comment section, and of course some corrections I needed to make on games I said didn't run on the Steam Deck. And of course, seeing how Dragon Quest is a big franchise for Square Enix, they were of course going to release more games on Steam. So I kind of felt now was the time to go back to this topic, and take a look at some more Dragon Quest games running on the Steam Deck. And before we dive right in, I'm going to let you guys know I'm not using the same Steam Deck I used in my original video. Instead, I'm using the Steam Deck OLED, which has that OLED screen which is 90Hz as well. And there are some slight performance improvements. And unlike before where we used canned footage to record the Steam Deck, this time we're using the Steam Deck dock to directly capture from the Steam Deck. Though there will be some points where I will be using some canned footage, which I'll explain why later. So with that out the way, let's dive right in. To begin, I want to take a look at 3 games Valve claimed was unsupported on the Steam Deck: Dragon Quest Builders 2 and Dragon Quest Heroes 1 and 2. I said before, Dragon Quest Heroes 1 and 2 ran on the Steam Deck while Dragon Quest Builders 2 did not run on the Steam Deck at all. And specifically talking about Dragon Quest Builders 2, I was actually wrong on that fact. Turns out you can actually change your Proton settings to experimental, and Dragon Quest Builders 2 could run, even back then when I recorded that original video. But since then, Valve has continued to improve Proton, and currently right now at Proton 8.0, Dragon Quest Builders 2 runs without a hitch. You don't need to switch into Proton experimental to get Dragon Quest Builders 2 to run. And hell, even the FMV cutscenes now run as well. And the same thing applies to Dragon Quest Heroes 1 and 2. The performance has greatly improved on both of those games. And on top of that, the FMV cutscenes, which I mentioned previously did not run, now run even though they're on a pretty low bitrate. So it's definitely nice to see, because of the improvements made to Proton, games now run a lot more optimally on the Steam Deck. Even though the performance is not perfect on games like Dragon Quest Heroes 1, as you see right here. But nonetheless, I do commend Valve for improving their backend with Proton. But we're still not done yet with the official Dragon Quest games, as more Dragon Quest games have released on Steam, being Dragon Quest Treasures and Infinity Strash Dragon Quest The Adventures of Dai, to which Valve claims both of those games are verified to run on the Steam Deck. To which Valve is correct, these games do run pretty well on the Steam Deck. Dragon Quest Treasures runs at max settings at 60 frames per second. Same thing applies for Infinity Strash, running somewhat consistent at 60 frames per second on max settings. The reason I say somewhat is because there are some times where the frame rate does dip, mostly because there's a lot of things going on screen. But other than that, cutscenes run at a consistent 60 frames per second, gameplay runs relatively smooth. You're definitely going to have a good time playing Infinity Strash on the Steam Deck. Well, that is if you still care about this game. Though there is one more game to talk about, being Dragon Quest X offline, but unfortunately, I can't talk too much about it because it's region locked to Japan only. And the only way you have access to this game is by creating a Japanese Steam account and also getting a Japanese Steam card. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to do this just for one game. And on top of that, it's just a bit of a hassle just to get that all set up. Though I will say, if they ever do localize this game to the West, I will take a look at it. And those are our officially released Dragon Quest games on Steam. But we're not done yet because, like I said, the Steam Deck OLED has a 90Hz screen. And I wanted to see if games could run at 90 frames per second. I didn't take a look at Dragon Quest Builders 2, Dragon Quest Heroes 1 and 2, and Infinity Strash because I know for a fact those games are capped at 60 frames per second. Meaning we can only take a look at Dragon Quest Treasures and Dragon Quest 11. And of course I took a look at Dragon Quest Treasures first. I set the game at 90 frames per second, still kept the max settings on first, and of course the game didn't run at 90 frames per second on max settings, tending to hover around the high to mid 70s, sometimes reaching the low 80s, but definitely for sure it was not getting a consistent 90. So I decided to lower down the settings to lowest settings possible, to see if we can get 90 frames per second. And the answer was yes. I actually got a more consistent 90 frames per second, sometimes dipping down to 89 frames per second, but mostly it maintained a consistent 90 frames per second. So if you want to play Dragon Quest Treasures at 90 frames per second on the go, there you go. And then I decided to take a look at Dragon Quest XI's. I didn't take a look at the original vanilla version because that game is more graphically intensive, and of course that game is not going to run at 90 frames per second. So I took a look at the more graphically inferior 11S. And the answer is no. I couldn't get the game running at 90 frames per second. I tested it at the most intensive area being Heliodor, and the game just did not want to reach 90 frames per second. Hell, even on max settings, it couldn't even reach 60 frames per second. So I dropped everything down to the lowest settings possible, and of course performance improved, but not by much, as the game ran around the 70s, I believe. But I wasn't done yet. I was determined to see if we could get this game running at 90 frames per second, and seeing how the body scene for Dragon Quest XI's is pretty big, I went ahead to see if there was any kind of presets that allowed us to have the lowest settings possible. And I stumbled across the Steam Deck preset settings and this low spec setting right here. I first did the Steam Deck config and still didn't get 90 frames per second. It hovered around the 60 to 70. And then I downloaded the low spec setting and it was slightly better, but not by much. It was still hovering around the 70s. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion we couldn't get Dragon Quest XI's to run at 90 frames per second. But even then, I consider 90 frames per second an added bonus, especially for a handheld. So I'm kind of surprised I at least got above 60 at the very least. And now moving on, I want to take a look at some requested games on the comic section in my original video. Particularly from Erdrick Hero, as he requested a lot of games for me to test and see if they run on the Steam Deck. He first requested 3 Itadaki Street games, one on the PS2, one on the PSP, and one on the Nintendo Wii. And I took a look at all of them, and they seem to run fine other than the PSP one, as I noticed during gameplay that game ran around 20 frames per second, though I'm not entirely sure if that's natural for that game to run at 20 frames per second on original hardware, or if it's just the emulation messing up. But other than that, every other game seems to run at a pretty consistent frame rate. And then he wanted Dragon Quest V on PS2, to which I took a look, and the game ran fine. Didn't notice any issues. And he wanted the Switch ports of Dragon Quest 1 through 3. And I took a look at them on Ryujin X. I'm pretty sure the performance is similar on Yuzu, and the games do run pretty consistently at 30 frames per second. I didn't notice any kind of emulation snafus. And he wanted to see if Dragon Quest X could run on the Steam Deck. And initially I wasn't too sure if I wanted to take a look at this game, because I remember seeing Ryan from Battlegeeks Plus trying to run this game and he wasn't successful, so I wasn't sure if I was going to be successful. But ultimately I decided to give it the good old college try. I first ran the installer as a non-Steam game, and I was able to install it just fine. And then I loaded up the launcher as a non-Steam game, and I was able to download everything I need. And then I ran the game on the regular Steam OS, and the game ran just fine, running at a pretty consistent 60 frames per second, and I didn't notice any kind of issues here and there. The one thing to clarify, I did not try the English translation like DQX Clarity or anything like that. I just ran it straight through, and it worked just fine. Though I did hear if you're from another country, you might need to do some extra steps. But overall, I was able to get it to run and I didn't notice any kind of issues. And those are all of the Dragon Quest games that were requested for me to try out. But we're still not done yet, because I want to take a look at a few games I felt I missed, or I just wanted to try out for myself. And the first game we're taking a look at is Dragon Quest Swords on the Nintendo Wii. And seeing how I was testing Fortune Street on Nintendo Wii, I felt why not take a look at the one Dragon Quest game that released on Wii internationally, being Dragon Quest Swords, the big old waggle game. And I didn't stop there, I also grabbed my Mayflash Wii bar, connected it up to my Steam Deck, loaded up my Wiimote, and it worked just fine, and I was able to waggle my way when playing Dragon Quest Swords. I didn't notice any performance issues, the game seemed to run just fine. So yeah, even though you might need to keep your Steam Deck stationary, you can play Dragon Quest Swords and you can waggle to your heart's content. And the next game I took a look at was Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince. Again, seeing how I was testing Dragon Quest 1 through 3 on Nintendo Switch, I wanted to see if the latest game could also run on the Steam Deck. And on Ryujin X, unfortunately, the game does have performance issues running around the mid-teens. And I did notice some weird graphical hiccups which I wasn't able to replicate when I recorded, but do know I did notice those. And noticing these issues, I know for a fact Yuzu sometimes has a better performance or even worse performance. So I decided to test and see if Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince ran better on Yuzu. And the answer was yes. The game does run a lot better on Yuzu, running around the mid-20s. It's not perfect, of course, but hey, it's at least better than Ryujin X. So for Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince, highly recommend playing this on Yuzu until a Steam port comes out. And finally, I wanted to see if Dragon Quest Plus could run on the Steam Deck. If you don't know what Dragon Quest Plus is, it's a fan-made game made by Nightfly Studios, and it was definitely the talk of the town for Dragon Quest fans back in November when it originally came out. And I wanted to see if the game could run. And the answer is yes, it does run. Only problem? The performance is terrible. The only time I got a consistent frame rate was in Tanagon Castle, where I ran consistently at 60 frames per second. Elsewhere in the world, it either ran at 30 frames per second, hell, I even saw it in the single digits. And to be fair, my initial testing was on the vanilla release. So I went out and downloaded the latest patch, and to give it a fighting chance, I downloaded the cloudless version just so there's less things to render and what have you. And that sort of fixed up the performance issues a bit, though not by much. Areas that still ran at 30 frames per second still run at 30 frames per second, though thankfully, areas that ran at the single digits run a lot better now. So while Dragon Quest Plus is playable on the Steam Deck, it is not recommended because of the bad performance. And to be fair, we do know the reasons why this game isn't running well on the Steam Deck. As Nightfly Studios has confirmed, any AMD setup tends to run this game pretty bad. And if you look at the specs of the Steam Deck, things make a lot more sense to why this game runs like crap. And as we know right now, Nightfly intends to release an AMD patch to fix up the performance issues, and wherever that comes out, I will indeed take a look at that. But for now, all we have to do is wait. And wait we shall, as of course Nightfly has released the update of the AMD patch while I was editing the audio for this video. The story of my life. But regardless, I went out my way to download the patch, and lo and behold, the performance has greatly improved compared to what my initial testings were. A lot of areas now run more consistently at 60 frames per second. But even then, the performance is still not perfect. I notice when going to menus is when the performance starts dropping by particular frame rates. And even accessing more menus brings it down to the single digits. I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, but I'm testing it and I'm seeing performance drops. And even affects battles as well, as even though the performance there aren't as bad in comparison to accessing menus, you still notice a performance drop. But it's nice to see the performance greatly improved from before, and if you want to play Dragon Quest Plus on your Steam Deck, get the AMD version. And those are our games for round 2 of Dragon Quest on the Steam Deck. And I'm happy to say all the games we took a look at ran on the Steam Deck. Even though some performances weren't perfect, it's nice to see every single game running pretty competently for the most part. And as Valve continues to improve Proton, we're probably going to be at a point where all Dragon Quest games run perfectly on the Steam Deck. And I definitely can't wait when games like Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D and 12 come out for me to try out on the Steam Deck. Thank you guys for sticking to the end of this video, and it's definitely been a while since I did my last Dragon Quest on Steam Deck. So let me know what games have you tried out on the Steam Deck down in the comments below. And if you like this video, consider hitting that like button. And if you want to see more videos, definitely do check out these videos here. I think you'll enjoy them. See you guys on the next one. Take care.